So I just played a randomizer playthrough of A Link to the Past for the first time, and I basically loved it. What a perfect way to breathe new life into the game. I played this game since I was 4 years old, so I gotten so bored of it that I could only replay it if I was using glitches to try to get as many items before rescuing Zelda as possible. And this randomizer basically did what I wanted. Let me play the game in a brand new order by putting the items in new locations. Funny story, I had like 6 hearts in the Master Sword before even entering the first dungeon. On the second playthrough I had some worse luck, but still the Master Sword in the Light World. The inherent problem with this though is backtracking. Tons of times you hit a dead end and have to walk out of the dungeon and come back to it later. You're basically forced to beat the whole game in almost one sitting or write down how far you got into each dungeon, because otherwise you'll never remember how far you got in each one and which ones you need to go back to. I beat the game in 2 sittings and went from really enjoying myself to very frustrated by bad luck at the end of the first one. I couldn't beat the first dungeons of either world for the longest time because the bow was in Ganon's castle. I was locked out of Beat Ice Palace in the third Dark World dungeon because they didn't have the fire rod or bombos. And this game is already having backtracking as its biggest problem as it is. I think it would have really helped if the randomizers made you start out with the flute and had it work right away. No stupid side quests where you have to go all the way to Kakariko Village just to activate it. Minish Captain to that. I didn't get the flute until I was basically done with the game. And in the second playthrough, I don't think I got the flute at all. The biggest problem I ran into with my playthrough was that, well, for my first one anyways, I had chosen Triforce Hunt. And then I got the 20 shards and got the credits. But then I got the 21st. Because they made more than just 20 shards for the game. I got the 21st, and I got taken to the credits again. And then I got the 22nd, and got dragged to the credits again. Who thought that was a good idea? Making you get dragged out of a dungeon force a soft reset or speed up through the unskippable credits every subsequent shard. It got to the point where eventually I started save stating before opening any group of chests because I didn't want to get dragged to the credits in the middle of Ganon's castle, and I was glad that I did save state multiple times. And this was because they weren't expecting you to play the game past the 20th shard. It's the whole fun of a randomizer is finding out what item is in every item location, which requires 100% playthrough. Of course I was going to keep playing past the Triforce Hunt. How was I supposed to know I'd have this problem? You'd think they'd know that's a problem and fix it. That's so sloppy. There are things I really love about the randomizer. It skips past unnecessary time-wasting texts, like the text you get from the treasure chests and Piece of Hearts, and talking to Zelda or the Sage, and going to the old man on the mountain, and the long text from the Crystal Maidens, and the text from the pendants. All of that text is conveniently skipped. Even the NPC text is shorter and replaced with somewhat humorous dialogue. In fact, I know for a fact that the Crystal Maiden, the thief disguised as a Crystal Maiden, has different dialogue depending on, because on my first playthrough I put him in the light and he said something, and I know for a fact he said something else the second time I put him in the light. Seems like a little too much extra effort, but whatever. Because of all the convenient text skipping, and the option to bring up the item menu instantly, though it's kind of disorientingly fast, I ended up still waiting half a second anyways for a while. It feels, because of all this convenience, it feels like a remake of the original game. It's just objectively better. It's faster paced. This is the definitive version of the game. So what confuses me then is that it doesn't have the extra features from the GBA remake, if it's so great. Where's the shop in the Village of Outcasts that sells that golden bee if you show him it? Where's the shop that sells every shield? Where's that great spin attack and the third woodcutter? It keeps throwing me off that I can't pick up rupees by attacking them with a sword. Not that it matters since the wishing wells are on vacation, removing the game's most valuable rupee sink. All they do is give you a red potion, and if they're on vacation, they shouldn't even be there. So it just adds insult to injury. They bothered to add a 4th digit to your wallet, but with almost nothing to spend money on, you only need to spend like 620 rupees to beat the game. It's only helping on a superficial level, as it feels a lot better to never have rupees feel like they're going to waste. But yeah, so many things they could have fixed. They still count saving as a death. That meant I had 101 deaths by the time I had gotten 20 shards, even though I didn't get a game over once. I'm not really sure how anyone could get a game over in this game, to be honest. And where's that 9th warp spot to Turtle Rock? It's not like it would have been hard. So the only explanation for why the GBA remake stuff aren't here is sheer laziness. And that confuses me. They put in the effort in making all these different customization options and even giving you dozens of different character sprites you can choose from. Most of which suck, but are at least better than the original pink-haired Link sprite because that shit is ugly. But they give you all this stuff, but giving the game the GBA extra features? Nah, that sounds like work. I'm basically in love with the idea of the randomizer. I'm never playing the game the normal way again. I want to try out every option. I'm so excited, but it feels like it could be better. You're basically forced to use the glitch where you walk through walls in order to beat the game. No matter what. Because eventually you'll get stuck because you can't have the item mandatory for beating a dungeon. I had to clip through the walls to get the bow and get into Ganon's castle. That's part of the fun, the new experience, so that's not really a problem. I mean, if you want to play this game differently, like with a randomizer, then you're probably already familiar with these glitches anyways. I just take issue with the fact that if you try to enable major glitches or overworld glitches, which I did and nothing happened, it warns you, you need knowledge of major glitches to beat the game. But you need knowledge of major glitches regardless, no matter what. It's false advertising. I apologize if it sounds overly critical, I'm just giving constructive criticism. I love this whole concept. I love that I can play with different characters. I chose the Crystal Maiden, and on my second playthrough I chose Zelda, and on my third attempt I chose Minish Caplink, who sticks out like a sore thumb. This is amazing, and I love how they keep keys in certain chests most of the time to avoid making dungeons unwinnable from running out of keys. But it could be a little better, that's all. I started a second playthrough, this time with major overworld glitches. That option doesn't do anything either, by the way, and all dungeons as the goal, with Zelda. At one point I was worried that the Desert Palace had blocked me off 2 chests because I didn't get a key. The key that you knocked down with the Pegasus Boots you conveniently start the game with was replaced with something else. Then it turned out the key was actually in the big key chest. Also, the game is annoyingly inconsistent in that at first it seems to be being convenient by having it so that even if you don't have the lantern, you can still have light just fine while navigating the sewers area. But after that point, the lantern is mandatory or else you'll be in pitch darkness. So if you don't have the lantern for the Eastern Palace, the stupid Bubbles room, or the cave with the old man, which has pits in it, you're going to be forced to hold down the B button and go by the light of your sword, or navigate with sword beams if you're lucky. But I fell into a pit and lost the sword beam pretty soon. That sucked in my second playthrough. But worst of all, once again on my second playthrough, I had the worst of luck because I could have sworn that they updated the randomizer so that they would make sure you'd have the Moon Pearl and Magic Mirror at the very worst right before having beaten all the Light World dungeons. I wasn't so lucky. It took me forever just to get the Moon Pearl. Fortunately, saving and quitting the Dark World as a bunny gets you back to the Light World and reload. But basically, I got in a situation where I'm now forced to use the Walk Through Walls glitch with an image of the Underworld on my laptop as a map to go into dungeons to get as many chests as I can, hoping I'll get the Moon Pearl at least, which I eventually did. All the while knowing if I beat the boss of a dungeon, the pendant or crystal won't fall because the game doesn't know that I'm in that dungeon. And it's not every dungeon that you can hop into. With the Dark Palace, you can only hop into it successfully if you, 1, don't loop around the map by going too far left or right, because then things in the dungeon don't load correctly, removing the crystal switch. And 2, you have to glitch into the room requiring arrows to defeat the enemies, because for some reason Link just pops through the wall on his own there. Try to hop out of anywhere else, and you'll either go invisible and unable to do anything or get stuck in a wall. Also, if you try to go into that mimic room from the east, then you'll actually pop out of the wall in a completely enclosed dummy room, and you won't be able to do anything because you'll just be stuck in there. So you have to go through the left, which is kind of convoluted. You have to carefully go to the mimic room from the left. The Watergate Palace has to get stuck in a wall no matter what, and basically forces you to save and quit no matter where you're in it. So it's completely unhoppable. The third Dark World dungeon, Skull Woods, has practically no lower level, and the one room with that lower level not only has the invisible and useless scenario, but it's also in a secluded part of the dungeon. You won't get all the chests from there. Ice Palace can only be glitched into from the conveyor belt and Stealth Host room. You just pop into them. But that's past the point of no return in the dungeon. Missing a whole bunch of chests and not allowing you to backtrack out of the dungeon and enter it properly. And worst of all, the Fire Rod's mandatory to beat certain enemies and thus the boss, and therefore spawn some chests and get past the first room anyways. And Turtle Rock? Forget about it. It's Crash City. So the only dungeons I have available to me are Thieves Town, Mystery Mire, Ganon's Tower, and Dark Palace after taking a very specific route into it. 4 dungeons. Not one of them had the magic mirror. And even in my first playthrough, I didn't get to find every item. I still finished without the shovel and without every heart container. My second playthrough I could never finish because I could never get the magic mirror at all. And most inexcusable of all, the game didn't spawn a key that was mandatory for beating Turtle Rock. And when I used an infinite keys code to get past that, the game didn't spawn the big key either, even when I used the code to get... Even when I used an always have the big key code. So, I was basically locked out of the rest of the dungeon through no fault of my own. All because they randomized 2 chests that they shouldn't have. And earlier, I tried to get some Mystery Mire and get its Pender Crystal. I had beaten the dungeon earlier, but the game doesn't drop the Pender Crystal for beating the boss. It doesn't know you're in the dungeon because you entered it through a glitch. And at that point when I left the dungeon, I didn't have the medallion to arise the dungeon so I could enter it properly. By the way, they also randomize which medallion you need to enter every dungeon. And even if I did, I can't remember, I need to use the mirror to let the game know that I'm in Dark World after I go out of the Dark World dungeon from glitching in the Light World. So if the game doesn't know I'm in the Dark World, I can't get that crystal. So I tried every cheat code I could to try to get some Mystery Mire that didn't involve truly cheating by using a code to give me an actual item in my inventory, which would kind of defeat the purpose of a randomizer if I used it. But every type of walk-through wall code that I tried didn't work. Even the codes that let you break walls supposedly by using the bombs, a sword, or hammer. I know for a fact that I've used the walk-through walls vertically code on my SNES and it worked, but for this, it didn't. But the always have Zelda following you around code works though. The point is I couldn't beat my second playthrough, and when I used an entrance randomizer instead, I quit on that one very early on because it was too disorienting. Plus it's bad enough they randomized the entrances, but apparently an entrance randomizer randomizes the items too. So I'll stick to item randomizers this time, all while hoping the game will actually be possible to beat. Also, update on everything. By the way, I just replayed most of Unleashed Wii, right up to the final act of Werehog Eggman Land, and I loved it. That's a surprising thing. Even the Werehog is much better on the third time you're experiencing all the levels, because I'm actually good at the game and know what to do now. I know that I can pick up and throw certain enemies like the spherical ones and the wizards, for example, which makes things a lot easier. And I know the unintuitive tricks of certain platforming challenges, like you have to be at the right side of the poles and stuff and jump off them. And it actually feels kind of thrilling, like not just standing there and holding the X button to grab onto the poles that are above me, but actually jumping ahead and then holding the X button to grab onto the poles, risking falling to my death, but I usually don't. It's thrilling doing that. Combat's still shit though. There's only one attack button, and so every attack I do feels random. So that's really frustrating. There's not much strategy. Sadly, the day stages were actually really tough for me to get used to again after Generation spoiled me with its smooth drifting controls. It feels so stiff now. It's all because of the way the drift controls. Make sure to drift as much as possible. Basically, I replayed the game in French and mostly replayed it in one sitting at that, and I was surprised by how much I liked it. Even on one sitting, even without breaks between the Werehog levels. I take it back, Unleashed is a good game, even if the Werehog is flawed. Really, the worst things about it are the don't break the ice / pots mandatory day missions. I almost beat the ice one on the first try, and then a mandatory dash pad at the end sent me right into the ice. Though the pot mission wasn't nearly as bad as I remembered. I think you're supposed to just let go of everything when you hit a dash pad there. So the worst parts aren't the Werehog, they're those stupid forced missions. And the boss fights, although the bosses are better in the second playthrough when you're good at them. I never died to them in the second playthrough. In fact, I could count the amount of times I died in this game, this playthrough, on one hand. It wasn't until that bullshit walking on very narrow pathways over a pit with slippery controls area in Shamar Night that I got a game over. Really, the game doesn't get really bad until, again, the ice mission forces you to play it at a crawl, and Eggman Land. That stupid forced day mission where you have to beat under a bullshit strict time limit that keeps ticking down when you die. It encourages you to be slow and careful because there's a time limit, but quick stepping when you're going slow just makes you do a stupid roll 2 million yards to the side and die. At least it didn't take me a half hour this time. Probably because I made a personal rule to only rage quit and reset the mission if I died at the very start. It's the night levels that eventually made me give up. Those are just frustrating. And of course I didn't want to replay the terrible final bosses again. But all in all, I had a more enjoyable time replaying Unleashed than I did with SA2. That was just a frustrating experience, especially because it controls a lot worse than I remember it to. I think SA2 was in an uncanny valley where I expect its controls to be way better than they are, because they control so close to perfection, but I go just a little too far to the left or right when I just tap the control stick left or right. And that throws me off so much. Whenever I go back to SA2 nowadays, I'm just really annoyed by how precise the controls are. And with an Xbox 360 controller, it's even worse. So it's not the GameCube analog stick being slippery that's the problem. I tested out both versions, and after having replayed the entire game in French, I most recently was only able to bring myself to replay one level on both versions because the controls annoyed me that much. Also, doing that taught me that you can't re-watch the final cutscene of SA2 unless you go to the trouble of beating Final Hazard again. Which is really terrible, to be honest. But for the most part, I'm just having lots of fun making my video reviews of the Archie Sonic comics. I'm experiencing them for the very first time. And wow! A continuity of Sonic actually gives a shit about story. About putting love and care into crafting a sense of a living, breathing world with consequences and actual continuity. And plots that don't just feel like sterile, hollow experiences like in the games. Compared to the comics, the stories of the games are all just excuse plots where they only exist to get Sonic from level to level, and the characters aren't there to interact with each other like actual living beings. They just give out exposition and want to beat Eggman. Note how in the entirety of the games' history, we've never seen what Knuckles thinks of Tails because they don't interact properly, just giving out exposition and stuff. Even though they spent an entire game together in Sonic Heroes. But I just read a story where Knuckles and Tails were on a desert trip together, and I learned how Knuckles thinks of Tails just like that, on their first ever time together. He thinks he's just a stupid little kid. Well, at least there's something. My point is, if you're like me and you're unsatisfied with the Sonic series because, unlike in the adventure games, they don't make good stories anymore, and you insist on getting that from the games, you're barking up the wrong tree. That's what the comics are for. Comics are a story-focused medium. Games are just games. It's right there in the title. They're games. I just got into the comics, and while they don't exactly have a consistent quality, it's the Sonic series, we expect. I'm glad I got into the comics because I have never been happier as a Sonic fan in my life. I'm getting a void filled in me, something that's been missing from the Sonic experience all my life. Something that I could only satisfy through fanfiction reading. It helps that I'm also reviewing them, so even if a comic is bad, I can still have tons of fun nitpicking it to death and getting catharsis out of it. Point is, the games weren't really meant for story anyways. Story was never the point. And I don't think they ever really cared about it to begin with. I mean, even in SA2, the zenith of game storytelling for Sonic, they still didn't really feel like the heroes were actually interacting like people, like friends. All they cared about was fighting Eggman. That's all they really talked about. Ever since 4, I've eventually given up on getting a satisfying story out of a Sonic game ever again that is an excuse plot that's written like a sterile, confused, fan service-filled clusterfuck, instead of a genuine living, breathing world that cares about the characters and wants you to get invested. You know, you'd think that wouldn't be so hard, and the comics prove that it isn't. That's what the comics are for. So, if you're focusing on Adventure 3 as a great story for the Sonic series, well, that's what the comics are for. That's not really... There's no really point to that anymore.